Thanks for staying with us. The latest census data has revealed an increase in migration, with 2.4 million foreigners living in South Africa. Of this number, Zimbabweans account for over 1 million. The numbers have also shown a growth in semigration, with the Gauteng and the Western Cape leading the pack. Gauteng has 5.18 million people, with the Western Cape accounting for 2.4 million people. For more on this, I am joined by Graeme Gotz, who is a director at the Gauteng City-Region Observatory. Graeme, a pleasure to have you on the program this afternoon. Let's begin with the issue of semigration. I mean, this is discussed internally. While trying to understand what is it, how is it evolving, and are there unexpected trends which are challenging the norms here?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that we are seeing some really surprising results from the census. We've seen some headline results over the last headline findings over the last couple of days, and some media reports that screen things like Zimbabwean population in South Africa surges to over 1 million. And then you read detail of the story, and they say there's just been a modest increase in the proportion of the population that's born outside the country. We really are still unpicking the numbers. We must remember that there's more data to be released. We haven't seen all the data yet, certainly not at the more fine-grained statistical geography scales, like wards. And so we're still trying to figure out things. But what we're seeing is really surprising, that it doesn't automatically confirm some of our basic assumptions about massive influx of migrants into our cities, in particular in Gauteng. And I can talk to you about that in more detail. In terms of semigration, and this is one of the things that we've really picked up on, there does seem to be a couple of points in the data that confirm semigration out of Gauteng to places like the Western Cape is a factor reshaping our city. So one headline number I can give you is that Gauteng lost 400,000 white residents between 2011 and 2022. The Western Cape gained 300,000 whites. And half of that number came from Johannesburg. Half of the 400,000 came from Johannesburg. So we're definitely seeing a big trend in that respect, if the numbers are to be believed.
Graeme, let's speak policy. I mean, policy-wise, how can provinces handle what's called positive net migration, managing resources as well as infrastructure as well?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is to understand the trends that we're seeing from the survey. And I just want to give you a sense of the complexity that we're looking at and where the surprises are. So we're seeing a situation where Gauteng increased from 12.7 million people in 2011 to just over 15 million people. So that's a growth of its 2011 population by about a quarter, 2.5 million people. Now that seems big, but that's 1 million short of what Stats SA estimated in its mid-year population estimates last year. And if you look at the growth rates, we're seeing something really dramatic. So 4.3% growth between 1996 and 2001. That comes down to 2.7% between 2001 and 2011. And it comes down again to just 1.9% between annual growth between 2011 and 2022. So we tend to think about Gauteng as this incredibly fast-growing city region, but the census data is saying we're growing at pretty much the background growth of the country as a whole. And that's a really surprising finding. So before we talk about policy in respect of things like how do we manage this influx of migrants, we've got to understand what's going on.
So the census also mentions demographic shifts. How might this influence local economies and cultural landscapes as well in the affected regions?
Yeah. I mean, so I'm just going to talk about Johannesburg specifically. I mean, Johannesburg presents one of the most surprising results out of the census. It's growing at just 0.8%. Between 2011 and 2022. And we tend to think about Johannesburg as the very center of our country, the heartland, economic heartland, the financial center, the cultural melting pot, similarly to New York, the cultural melting pot of our country. But and obviously we have to pause and question whether that data is correct. But if the data is in fact correct, it suggests that there's a dramatic shift in the way in which people conceive of themselves in the city. Us people in the planning profession we like to say that the only thing more scary than immigration is a low-growth city, because what it says to you is that people literally don't want to live here. So I know it sounds like a little bit of a relief if migration figures are lower than what you would expect, but if people don't want to live here, if they're disinvesting their expectations, their future life prospects from wanting to be in a particular place, that has dramatic implications.
Right.
Dramatic implications on social cohesion, dramatic implications on the property market, and so on. And all of those have policy implications.
Are there any noticeable patterns in the types of industries or even sectors which are attracting migrants who are contributing to the economic dynamics of specific provinces?
Yeah, so I think one of the big stories here is, of course, semigration. And remember, of course, that we were coming out of a period of the COVID crisis. We were seeing a situation where many people were working from home for a period, but there was a class of people in the advanced services sector who could work from any remote location anywhere in the country. And that trend has lessened, but it's continued. And so we're seeing a situation where IT jobs, certain jobs in business services, finance professionals, etc., they can do their work from pretty much anywhere in South Africa. They could work from the Midlands, they could work from the Western Cape towns, or anywhere else in the world for that matter. And so I'm flipping your question around.
Yeah.
In fact, what we see is the changing nature of work may mean that less and less people feel like they need to be in this economic heartland to actually work here. They don't need to be here physically. Now, there's always going to be jobs that attract people to the city. People without skills are going to look for work in the city, in households, in manufacturing, and so on. In mining, but in Gauteng, the mining industry has long been in decline. Yes, there are still mines, but it's a tiny fraction of the economy and the work generating part of our society.
I'd like to labor a bit more on the issue of semigration. I mean, it often relates to lifestyle choices. Can you provide examples of how this choice influences local communities and amenities in destination areas?
Yeah, so I mean, I can't necessarily talk beyond the sort of anecdotal, but we are seeing a situation where people are moving out of the city in a way that just says, look, I'm tired of this, this infrastructure crisis. I'm tired of the traffic. I'm tired of the fast pace of life here, and they're happy to move out of the neighborhoods that they've historically been in a way that might do damage to those communities. It might collapse local property markets, for example. The social fabric gets torn as families move younger people out of the city to go find work in other places. We might see a situation where people come into the city only occasionally. I've seen this in places like Hoedspruit, for example, where people have second homes. And 20 years ago, it was a small railway town. Now there's lifestyle estate after lifestyle estate, and people only come into the city only once in a while. When that happens, the people who can move out do. They take their tax revenue with them, and that puts a massive strain on the level of taxable resources that a city has. So if you're asking the question, where do we get the money to fix that failed infrastructure network? Well, that comes from those wealthy residents who've located to Hermanus or Hoedspruit.
So we are fast running out of time, but we also mentioned a bit earlier on in our conversation that Census 2022 shows a surge in the Zimbabwean population here in South Africa. What are some of the factors and the regions that are driving this as well?
So Zimbabweans make up about 1 million. This is the newspaper headline, of course. Zimbabweans make up about 1 million residents of South Africa. But it's fair to say, and I really must emphasize, that's not dramatically higher than what it was last time around. Zimbabwe is the largest sending country for migration. There's distant seconds of other countries. The UK is mentioned in some of the reports, but it is a story of migration from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and so on. The continued difficulties in the economies of those countries are obviously factors in sending people here. But I do want to re-emphasize the point that the census data, if it's correct, is not suggesting that we're seeing an overwhelming number of foreign migrants. In fact, I just want to note a statistic. Census 2011 says that in Gauteng, 56% of the population in 2011 was born in Gauteng. This time around, it's 64%. And what that basically means is that there's less people coming in from other places. So, this notion that we're being overwhelmed by Zimbabweans, it just doesn't stack up in terms of the numbers. Again, according to Census, if those numbers are correct.
Graeme, let me thank you for your time. That's Graeme Gotz providing us some insight into the migration and semigration trends here in South Africa.